One sentiment that seems to be relatively prevalent amongst the Black Mirror fandom, especially pre-Netflix, is that the national anthem is one of the weaker shows in its run. While its critical reception was positive, fan reception has waxed and waned, especially as the series went on and people began watching Black Mirror out of order. Some of the reoccurring criticisms cite the lack of overt science fiction tropes or technology that the series was known for, making many feel like it didn't belong to Black Mirror, with some fans even arguing that you can outright skip the episode. While I understand that a cursory glance at the national anthem when compared to the rest of Black Mirror may make it seem like the episode is out of place, I vehemently disagree with that sentiment. Yeah, there's no evil app that makes people evil, but when Black Mirror is at its best, that's never what it was about. Because when you really examine the national anthem, its themes and ideas in relation to what the creatives behind Black Mirror want to say with their show, not only does it fit perfectly within the context of the series, but it might be the best episode of Black Mirror. Okay, so before I get into my own argument about the merits of the national anthem, we need to go over Black Mirror in a more general way. Unlike its forebears like The Twilight Zone or Tales from the Dark Side, which were either overtly supernatural or featured the kind of sci-fi with aliens that eat people, Black Mirror episodes are, relatively, much more grounded, as each episode functions around some sort of man-made technology that becomes warped and perverted by humanity. And I'd like to particularly emphasize that last part, warped and perverted by humanity. Black Mirror, at its best, uses technology as a jumping off point to explore humankind's predilection towards fucking things up. In this article covering Black Mirror creator Charlie Brooker, senior Wired author Matt Reynolds makes a particularly potent quote about what, in my opinion, makes the show compelling. At its heart, Black Mirror is about something much more disconcerting than whether our iPhones will murder us in our sleep. What if technology isn't actually the root of all our problems? What if it's us that's really flawed? And here's what makes Black Mirror interesting and where I believe the show often falls short. Black Mirror is at its best when the fantastical technology featured in the episode never gets ahead of the human element. That's the element that warps something that should be, in theory, morally neutral. When the show is at its worst, it becomes the look at this crazy smartphone that has an app that makes you evil. And unfortunately, I often find the show leans more toward the latter, especially as it went on. Cards on the table, I haven't watched a full season of Black Mirror since season 4. I just found that the show's quality continued to dwindle since its transition to Netflix, and my urge to continue to give it a second chance was beaten out of me by outright bad episodes like Crocodile and Metalhead. But the show's post-Netflix downgrade isn't why I'm making this video. I've had problems with Black Mirror since the second episode of the first season, and I think those problems have just become more blatant in the Netflix era. At the risk of being a bit reductive, I've found a formula that usually reflects how much I end up enjoying an episode of Black Mirror. If you read a brief synopsis about the technology of the week that kicks off the episode's plot, how long does it take you to think of ways it can go wrong? If we made a list of the potential repercussions of that technology, starting with the most obvious and ending with more obscure and unintentional as we spent more time thinking about the subject, where on this list would any given episode of Black Mirror lay? I found, again in general, the worse an episode of Black Mirror is, the repercussions and ideas it explores don't really go past the most obvious. When Black Mirror is at its best, it asks us questions about our own humanity, reframing the human experience through technology to give us another angle at how we navigate the world. So, with that in mind, let's briefly go over 3 Black Mirror episodes that fall on the spectrum at various levels, and let me explain how this relates to what I like and dislike about Black Mirror with concrete examples. The Entire History of You. This episode is uncontroversially considered one of Black Mirror's best and is even written by Succession creator Jesse Armstrong. Yeah, I don't think it's good. In this episode, the central technology is called a grain, an implant that records everything that the user hears and sees all the time. The episode centers itself around the degradation of a relationship as both members become obsessed with watching and dissecting certain interactions over and over. In a world where constant social media use is literally warping how people's brains work, I don't think most people need to use their creative muscles to imagine how a device like a grain could go wrong when it comes to relationship problems. Off the bat, we know a device like this would lead to disaster within the context the episode presents it in, exploring an insecure couple and a man who is already prone to jealousy. The repercussions of that put the audience in a state where they are ahead of the narrative. We all can see how bad something like a grain could go for these characters and are simply waiting for the story to catch up with us. Now, that isn't necessarily a problem with the grain itself, but rather how the entire history of you chooses to tell its story. The episode explores the idea of instant access to every memory you've ever had with 100% accuracy in possibly the least interesting way. While human memory is very fallible, imperfect, and sometimes dangerous, there is a fascinating discussion to be had about the value of memory, flaws and all. Is an idealized version of a memory a bad thing if it makes you happy? Is it wrong that you can't remember an argument you had with your mom 15 years ago? Is a concrete 100% accurate version of a memory inherently more meaningful than an impressionistic one? There is a neurological condition called hyperthymesia, defined by Merriam-Webster as the uncommon ability that allows a person to spontaneously recall with great accuracy and detail a vast number of personal events or experiences and their associated dates. A woman named Jill Price was the subject of the first scientific article about hyperthymesia and was the first person to be officially diagnosed with it. In an interview with ABC, Price's description of how it feels is as heartbreaking as it is fascinating.
That we have no idea how much of ourself is created by editing our memories.
Right. And I
to
don't
shape
do that.
ourselves.
Right. And I don't do that. Like, I still feel bad about stuff that happened 30 years ago.
But we all do, and I mean, we can all remember one or two things.
It's not one or two things, everything. And I really live it and feel it.
A device like the grain would give every human being the ability to experience life the way Jill Price does, which, by her own words, can often be debilitating. What would a society that has the ability to recall perfect memories on demand look like? How does it look when our sense of self is formed by playback and not recollection? These are all fascinating angles the entire history of you could explore, but doesn't. Instead, the episode tells a pretty by-the-numbers story about jealousy that could easily have the grain replaced with emails or text messages and still, more or less, play out the same way. Because of that, I'd rank this one pretty low on my Black Mirror scale of quality determinator. Striking Vipers. In this one, our central technology revolves around the titular virtual reality fighting game. This episode's version of VR is similar to the representations of the technology in classic works like Neuromancer, Snow Crash, and The Matrix, meaning all sensations, emotional and physical, are recreated digitally in the game world to the point where the brain can't tell the difference between the real and the virtual. The potential negative implications of this technology are sort of obvious, and have been explored in many works featuring similar themes and plot devices. Instead of harping on those well-worn themes, Striking Vipers chooses to essentially break down the very concept of human sexuality. In the episode, two straight male friends end up inadvertently forming a romantic and sexual relationship via their virtual avatars in the game. The hack conclusion to a story like this would be the guys figuring out they're actually in love or at least attracted to each other, but the ending of the episode subverts this. Concerned about what this virtual relationship means, the friends end up sharing an IRL kiss, only to discover that those romantic feelings they share for each other in the virtual world simply aren't there. I think this ending is infinitely more interesting than an alternate one where they ended up being a couple, or at least did have feelings for each other in the real world. What does this say about the nature of human attraction? What actually determines who we feel romantic and sexual attraction to and who we don't? What are the lines between being straight and being gay, and how much of that is formed by us innately and how much is formed by how we relate to each other in society? Now, this episode does have problems, and I'd argue that, like the entire history of You, the ideas it dances around are more interesting than the execution, though, in my opinion, Striking Vipers does a better job on my makeshift Black Mirror scale of quality determinator by choosing to explore its ideas in a less obvious way. It can go somewhere in the middle. Be right back. Domhnall Gleeson is bad at sex, likes the Bee Gees, and dies in a car crash 5 minutes into the episode. His girlfriend Martha is introduced to an AI company that, after uploading her boyfriend's various social media accounts and even private text and email conversations, will spit out an AI recreation of him that she will be able to have text conversations with. There are some pretty obvious ways this technology can go wrong. We've seen some real-life examples of similar AI attempting to recreate a dead person and just missing the mark.
Interesting.
But Be Right Back expands on this idea. Martha ends up going a step further and getting an experimental android uploaded with Domhnall Gleeson's AI personality. I think a worse version of this episode would tell a story about overcoming grief. I say that not because that idea isn't worth exploring, but because the dead coming back and not being quite right is a well-worn trope. We got things like The Monkey's Paw and Pet Sematary that explore these ideas cohesively. In contrast with those stories, Be Right Back doesn't choose to focus on the flaws of the AI recreation, rather, it goes in the opposite direction. Android Gleeson is almost too perfect. Yeah, he can satisfy Martha sexually in a way that Domhnall couldn't, but also gives in to Martha during an argument that his real-life counterpart never would. Everything about real Domhnall's personality said he wouldn't like a song like How Deep Is Your Love, to the point where even his own significant other expects him to hate it, but he likes it. Because as predictable as human behavior can be and is in the broad sense, individuals are almost incomprehensibly complex. A predictive algorithm could never recreate a human being exactly because humans are inherently flawed. And because of that, Be Right Back asks us a much more interesting question about the nature of human relationships. The little surprises, unpredictability, and even the flaws of those we care about are just as compelling as the more obvious positive traits. For me, this is what makes an episode that could have been obvious or cliche into something worthwhile. Instead of telling us that we have to move on from death, Be Right Back proposes a discussion about who we are as people. So I'd rank this pretty high on my Black Mirror scale of quality determinator. And this is what makes Black Mirror so compelling when it works. It uses technology to expose something about us, what makes us human, for better and worse. The technology used in any given episode should only reveal those aspects of the human existence, not create them. Alright, let's talk about the pig, the national anthem. Early in the morning, British Prime Minister Michael Callow is woken up by his team and informed that a royal, Princess Susanna, has been kidnapped and is being held for ransom. Callow is shown a video from the kidnapper in which the captured Susanna reads out their demands. The kidnapper will release her under one condition. By the end of the day, Callow has to have sex with a pig live on national television. Real quick, I want to point out that, unlike almost every other episode of Black Mirror, the national anthem takes place in a time period that is contemporary. There are no high-concept fictional technologies like a grain or a dating app that actually leads to a real connection. For all intents and purposes, the national anthem could be taking place today. In order to hold Callow accountable and prevent a government cover-up, the kidnapper has also released the video to several news media outlets. The first action we, the viewer, witnessed the fictional UK government take in its mission to save Princess Susanna is to send a DSMA notice to said media outlets to prevent them from playing the video on air. In a sort of thesis statement, the national anthem is telling us what this episode is really about. The players the episode focuses on, across the board, are not concerned about the princess's kidnapping. They are concerned about the public response to the princess's kidnapping. The bulk of the national anthem's first and second acts revolve around a sort of cat and mouse game between the government attempting to subvert the kidnapper's demands and various forms of media outing those attempts to the public. Eventually, out of options and with the public demanding Callow into action, he goes through with the kidnapper's demand. Callow commits the act of pig things, and the princess is released. The episode ends with a member of Callow's team being informed that the princess was released half an hour before Callow bed the pig, but the public, the media, and the government were too wrapped up in the sensationalism of Callow's act to notice. The kidnapper is revealed to be a famous artist named Carlton Bloom, whom, as the worst line of dialogue in the entire episode reveals, was trying to make some kind of point with the kidnapping.
So it's a statement.
Bloom ends up hanging himself shortly before Callow goes through with the act. So, before we get into the actual analysis of the episode, there are two core points I want to emphasize so we can all keep them in mind as we talk about it. One, the princess was, in all likelihood, never actually in any danger of losing her life, and two, Callow never had to have sex with the pig. Bloom released Susanna before he even knew Callow would go through with the whole pig thing, meaning the two fundamental elements that drive this episode forward, the things that cause all the players to take the actions they took, were both lies. Alright, so first, let's figure out what the actual technological villain of this episode is. What is the national anthem's android Donald Gleason? I believe this is a question worth exploring because I often see contention and confusion around the discussion of this episode online when it comes to this topic. Black Mirror, even at its best, is not a subtle show. And look, I fully acknowledge how silly this is going to sound considering how this episode ends, but the national anthem uses technology in a much subtler way than the vast majority of the series, to the point where viewers have trouble quantifying this episode within the context of Black Mirror as a whole, questioning whether it even belongs. Not only does the national anthem very much belong, it might reflect the ethos behind the show's creation better than any other episode in the series. So, as far as technology goes, the most common expression I've seen is that social media is the villain of the episode. I understand why people say this, and they're at least partially correct. But to lay the blame on social media solely ignores a large part of what the text is showing us. The episode is often framed as a traditional media versus social media sort of thing, and I fundamentally disagree with that reading. I say this because at what point in the episode are these two forms of media really at odds with each other? The answer is they aren't. Yeah, Bloom leaks the ransom video to YouTube, subverting the blackout that the news media was doing, but all that served was to give a justification to the news media to show the story and ignore the DSMA notice. Showing the story is what the news media wanted to do in the first place. Social media frees them from their shackles and gives them the out they needed to run the story without ruining their relationship with the UK government. Social media and traditional media are not at odds in the national anthem. They are working together. I will explore this idea of social media and traditional media working together later on, but for now, we need to have a clear idea about one thing. The technology the national anthem is highlighting isn't social media. It's just media. Specifically, it's mass news media that is designed to disseminate information to the public, and how sensationalism compromises media. Now, before you start leaving comments about the lamestream media and bragging about your lifelong Breaking Point subscription while sipping coffee out of your Jimmy Dore mug, let me be as clear as possible about what I mean by mass media being the highlighted technology of the national anthem. I'm not saying mass media is bad. If your takeaway after watching this video is mainstream media sucks, or journalism is dead, or social media was a mistake, then I have failed in communicating my idea clearly. Like I mentioned before, Black Mirror, when at its best, is never criticizing technology. It is criticizing humanity. A form of technology like mass media is morally neutral in conception, and how humanity implements it is when we can gauge its moral worth. Just keep all that in mind as we move forward. We cannot have a discussion about mass media that isolates it from the humans and systems that produce and perpetuate its worst aspects. To understand what I think makes the national anthem a successful episode of Black Mirror and how it uses technology to explore questions of humanity, we have to understand certain aspects of mass media and how they relate to what Brooker and company are saying with this episode. An exploration of this episode separate from the larger media apparatus it satirizes would be incomplete. So please, trust the ride. It may seem like I'm going on tangents here, but I promise it's all related. To that end, there are three core themes in how the national anthem chooses to explore mass media. and we'll start with... Alright, first let's jump back into this whole social media versus traditional media thing. Again, I reject the common notion that the national anthem is solely criticizing social media, because the entire war of social media versus traditional media is resolved basically at the beginning of the episode. The national anthem makes it clear that traditional media can't exert control over public discourse the same way it did before the internet. But that doesn't necessarily mean they are at odds with each other. The old guard of news media adapts, is informed, and is even empowered by the public's access to media through the internet. This is a concept known as trading up the chain, a phrase coined by Ryan Holiday in his 2012 book, Trust Me, I'm Lying. Trading up the chain essentially refers to the reciprocal and circular relationship between online news media and traditional established media outlets. The basic outline of the tactic goes something like this. A story is first published on a less reputable or credible medium, usually online. Think something like a tweet or a blog post. The story is then covered by a more established media outlet, like Fox News or the New York Times. Further media outlets will then cover the story, citing the more credible sources rather than the initial questionable one. And the story then, despite its dubious origins, becomes legitimized in the eyes of the public. 15 years ago, you would never see a tweet being covered by traditional news outlets. But the internet's increasing popularity, coupled with the endless growth required by modern capitalism, necessitated a media environment that inherently has to favor what would get the most eyes, not what is worth covering. Internet media informs traditional media then goes on to legitimize internet media. The two feed off each other and create an environment where a half-thought tweet created in 15 seconds can drive national discourse for a week. Despite coming out nearly a year before Holiday would coin the phrase in his book, the national anthem shows us a nearly perfect dramatization of how trading up the chain works and its potential negative consequences. Yeah, traditional media begrudgingly abides by the DSMA notice to maintain relationships with the government and perhaps out of some sense of moral obligation. But the instant the news leaks online, whatever loyalty or morality they have is outweighed by the fear of losing out on a big story. And because traditional media covered the story, it receives an air of legitimization among the general public that the initial source, remember it was just a video uploaded to YouTube, wouldn't be able to do on its own. After all, it is traditional news outlets that the episode's cast spends most of its runtime watching. The platform or method of distribution of any given form of media is irrelevant when the incentives behind them remain the same. The things that compromise traditional news outlets, things like shareholders, advertisers, and investors, are all things that compromise social media platforms. In the national anthem, both traditional media and social media are complicit in the same crime, creating an air of sensationalism in order to get eyes on their platforms, ultimately coming at the cost of the human beings they are covering. Which does lead us into the next core theme I want to discuss. Did you know that clickbait existed before the internet? In its purest form, clickbait is just a means to draw the potential viewer's attention, to get them to stop what are they doing and decide, in that moment, that the piece of media being offered to them is worth their time. In the earliest days of newspaper distribution, the papers would either be available in stores or by subscription. In 1833, The Sun began publication with a different strategy. The paper employed newspaper hawkers, those kids who stand on the street and yell at what the story of the day was. Because The Sun was not subscription-based and not sold in a regular storefront, the paper's editors had to tailor the stories in a way to entice a potential buyer to purchase it on the spot. And they had to do this every day to keep purchases coming. The Sun became notable and profitable because it was the first newspaper to cover things like divorce and death, hyperfixating on so-called human interest stories that other papers wouldn't write about. In a lot of ways, we can trace back the roots of modern media sensationalism to The Sun. When we examine the national anthem, we have to understand that the outcomes for both Callow and Susanna were both direct consequences of the media sensationalism storm that was a result of how various media entities in the episode chose to cover the story. Ask yourself a question. Throughout the entire episode, is the media actually informing the public in a constructive way? If their duty is to inform, to what end is that duty performed? Is it for the good of the public? We would have to ask ourselves what public good is being served. Is it to save the princess? One could argue that, had the public not known about the ransom, this whole ordeal could have been avoided. So, if the media in the episode is not informing, what is it aiming to do? There's a quote I want to share from the godfather of media analysis, Marshall McLuhan, from his seminal work, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man. Quote, "It is only today that industries have become aware of the various kinds of businesses in which they are engaged. When IBM discovered that it was not in the business of making office equipment or business machines, but that it was in the business of processing information, then it began to navigate with a clear vision." Likewise, the kind of media Black Mirror aims to satirize isn't in the business of disseminating information. It's in the business of holding viewers' attention to gain profit. The media is being manipulated. This is not an episode about people finding out information and then reacting to it neutrally. Everything from the kidnappers' methods of distribution, the government's response, and the media's reporting is designed to invoke a reaction from the viewer. Everything is done with a hyperfixation on how the public will react to the ransom demand. Bloom's choice of ransom is completely intentional, a larger-than-life request that can't help but draw in the attention of the viewer. Had he just requested money or some other typical ransom, the story inherently would not have gotten the same media attention. It is taboo, it is disgusting, but it is enticing. As we see at the end of the episode as Callow performs the act, people are disgusted, but they don't turn away. Yeah, mass media informs the public of Susanna's kidnapping, but to what end? Arguably, the revelation puts Susanna in more danger by setting the public stage of accountability for Callow's act. The UK government wants to rescue Susanna, but it is always through the lens of public reaction, a means to protect both the government and Callow's reputation, rather than to save the human being that is in trouble. Finally, the audience is glued to the screens not out of concern for the princess, but to see whether or not Callow will have to F the pig. To the media, the players in the story are inconsequential, a means to an end. They are in the business of attention, not information. The dehumanization, at least in my reading, is not intentional, but it is inevitable. On August 28th, 2020, a little infamous content mill that rhymes with ScreenRant.com published a less than tasteful story shortly after the announcement of Chadwick Boseman's tragic death. At the risk of being reductive, Boseman's death was a really big fucking deal, and any media publication covering the story had to be thoughtful about how they did so. Before the day had even ended, Screen Rant published an article speculating on who will take over the Black Panther role. And look, yeah, that would eventually become a mainstream pop culture talking point, but doing it mere hours after the announcement was, to put it mildly, in bad taste. Twitter toured Screen Rant a new fucking asshole, and before the end of the next day, the article was pulled down. I bring all this up not only because I believe it relates to the dehumanization in media that inadvertently happens, but also because I happened to be working at Screen Rant when this all went down, which, yeah, is its own can of worms that maybe I'll make a video about someday. So, as I scoured through the company's internal chats and emails concerning the controversy, I noticed an interesting phenomenon. The attitude amongst the higher-ups, editors, and the writer themselves was something I can only describe as a post-drunk cringe as one recalls what they did under inebriation the night before. It was almost literally an "ah shit, I can't believe I did that last night" moment. Everyone recognized the article was wrong. Everyone was clear on why people were upset. It seemed so obvious that the story was a bad idea, yet it got past multiple checks and balances and went up on the site. I genuinely believe that no one involved with the making of the article had bad intentions, yet they did this distasteful thing all the same. Let's ask ourselves a question. Throughout the national anthem, how many media and government figures are outright malicious? Outside of Bloom, I'd argue that no one, at least within the context of the actual text, seems to have any bad intentions. The government aims to rescue Susanna while preserving Callow's dignity, the news media reports an ongoing story, and that one dude just wanted to upload a selfie he took with a porn star. Yet, all those actions end up causing real, tangible pain for Susanna, Callow, and his family. This is the human cost of the big media machine. It creates a bureaucracy that inherently dehumanizes its subjects, Forgoing our own humanity in the name of profits for a giant corporation that doesn't care for us or the people in the story it presents. It creates an entity separate from the individuals that make up the enterprise. This entity doesn't care about the humanity of its subjects, despite the fact that the individual reporters and writers may. When you watch the episode, nothing any of the characters do suggests that they want Callow to fuck the pig, yet their actions end up making that outcome inevitable. In the rat race to tell the story, humanity was lost. And look, I'm not saying that there isn't cynicism or outright cynical actors throughout the media apparatus. There are. But I'd also say that capitalism's effect on the media machine inevitably leads to cynicism of the subjects it covers. Rather than cynical people making media that becomes cynical because of those people's biases, I'd argue that the media system itself is cynical and forces that cynicism out of the people who create it. When you watch the episode, the only way actions are given moral worth is through their effect on public perception through mass media. Prime Minister Callow's team reassures him that he won't have to go through with the whole pig thing, not because it's wrong to bang animals or as a stand against an unrealistic demand from the kidnapper, but because the public doesn't expect him to. Callow's wife shows concerns not for her husband or the kidnappee, but for what the public would think should Callow go through with the act. She doesn't express concern for the princess as a royal or even as a human being, merely listing off a few adjectives about what her public persona is. When Callow decides to go through with it, it is not because he wants to save the princess, it's because public consensus has now shifted to be in favor of Callow fucking the pig. Bloom didn't do this because he wanted to see Callow bang a pig. He wanted to show how a media storm could create an environment that becomes so sensationalized and removed from what is actually happening that the princess could be released, the thing that everyone wanted to happen, and no one noticed. And yeah, it's a little heavy-handed and extreme, but it is a more clear-cut and explicit dramatization of what happens in real life all the time.
Alright, you're kind of looking at me like you don't believe me, so here's an example of something that happened in real life that was basically the same thing.
July 19th, 2010, over a year before Black Mirror would make its debut. Shirley Sherrod, then Georgia State Director of Rural Development for the Department of Agriculture, was forced to resign from her position. This came only mere hours after Andrew Breitbart, yeah, that Breitbart, posted a video of Sherrod giving a speech at an NAACP fundraising dinner on the now defunct conservative blog site BigGovernment.com. In the video, Sherrod seemingly admits to discriminating against a farmer for being white. The story was picked up on Fox News' website and covered by both Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity. By the end of the day, both the NAACP and the USDA released statements denouncing Sherrod and her comments in the video. Nearly all mainstream outlets covered the story the way Breitbart's initial post presented it, uncritically parroting Breitbart's narrative that Sherrod was using her position of power to racially discriminate against white people. But the thing is, that wasn't true. Breitbart had posted a deceptively edited clip of Sherrod's speech, taking out key context that revealed the story was actually about Sherrod realizing that the poor white farmer was suffering despite his race, and recontextualized her own worldview about race and poverty. After the NAACP posted the full speech Sherrod gave, the media storm against her almost immediately turned tides. In the end, the USDA, the NAACP, and even fucking Bill O'Reilly made public apologies to Sherrod.
Alright, so I get the similarities between these two stories might not be immediately obvious, but let's break it down.
Andrew Breitbart posts a deceptively edited video of Sherrod's speech on his blog. Bloom uploads the video of Susanna to YouTube. Without doing any journalistic due diligence, mainstream media in both situations uncritically parrot the story. In the national anthem, the news team doesn't even entertain the idea of whether or not this video is real before pushing it out onto their platforms. Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly bought Breitbart's framing of Sherrod's speech unquestionably. They exist in a media environment that literally disincentivizes those kinds of checks and balances, especially with hot topics like conservative victimization and pig fucking. In the end, Sherrod lost her job, Callow banged a pig, and neither of them had to. And this is basically as clear a demonstration I can show of the media machine that creates an entity separate from the humans who create and are the subjects of the media. The national anthem makes it explicitly clear that even if everyone involved started by caring about the princess's well-being, by the end, it wasn't about her. The same way Screen Rant discarded the humanity of Chadwick Boseman and his fans by churning out a bad taste article to ride the wave of a trending topic, the same way Breitbart discarded Sharad's humanity to fan the flames of an ongoing culture war, Bloom and the larger media apparatus he took advantage of discarded Susanna and Callow's humanity in the name of their respective agendas. Before we get into how the national anthem fits into my little Black Mirror scale of quality thing, I want to bring this back to a question I pondered at the beginning of the video. Why do a sizable amount of the Black Mirror fanbase dislike this episode? There's a kind of reoccurring gag within the Black Mirror fandom about real-world events that the show accidentally predicted. The national anthem gets frequently brought up in these discussions because of a book called Call Me Dave by Michael Ashcroft, an unauthorized biography of former UK Prime Minister David Cameron. In the book, Ashcroft tells a story about Cameron's days at Oxford University, where Cameron allegedly put his dick in a dead pig's mouth. Yeah, I can see why people draw these parallels. It's got the 3 Ps: prime ministers, pigs, and penises. But the similarities are superficial. The actual circumstances around both these actions are so different that the only real reason one would harp on these parallels is if your entire takeaway from the national anthem was, ha ha ha, guy fuck pig. And there is some kind of poetic irony there. An episode about how media spectacle can lead to people ignoring what actually matters, that had rich themes and ideas about media sensationalism and the relationship between the internet and the old guard, became the guy fucks a pig episode of Black Mirror. And in some senses, that's almost because the national anthem is almost a little too successful at exploring its themes, to the point where people have trouble quantifying it within the context of the rest of the series. But at the same time, that's what makes me like it so much. When it comes to my own scale of Black Mirror judgment, this episode uses its core technology to explore the worst impulses of humanity in a way that's almost subliminal. It shows us a mass communication tool meant to inform that inadvertently does the opposite. It kept us from the truth. It, perhaps more than any other episode, makes us reflect on our own relationship to mass media. How easy it is for all of us to give in to our worst impulses about how we relate to other people outside of our immediate periphery. It's sobering and sad. The audience is just as disgusted with their own complicity with Callow's dehumanization as the viewers within the show are. While the national anthem doesn't give us any solution to humanity's misuse of mass media, I don't think it needs to. Perhaps, as the credits roll and the screen fades to black, some quiet contemplation about our own relationship to media is all it needed to do.